Hello, my name is Brad Olsen. I went down to Antarctica on a sailboat in 2019, and I'm here to tell you about some of the things I found down there and some of the great mysteries that I went to try to investigate, see if there was any validity to some of the claims of large motherships under the ice, pyramids poking through the ice, or antediluvian civilization. Also, the mystery of the black goo, which is, this backstory was the Falkland Wars was fought over the black goo. So we'll get into all that one by one, and thanks for being here on Super Soldier Talk. When I was researching my trip down to Antarctica, being a cartographer, map maker myself for some of the books that I write, I was poring over maps of Antarctica, both modern, charting out my voyage, and also ancient maps. And some of these ancient maps are very curious because they were drawn during the age of exploration. And on those maps, the continent of Antarctica is depicted. Now, what's so interesting about that is the continent of Antarctica was not discovered until 1821, when the first whalers and sealers who had read the account of Captain Cook sailing around the continent, but never discovering it. But he wrote in his account of the Southern Ocean that it was rich in seal and whale life. And back then, oil blubber was the main component to be used with the oil lamps that were prevalent in 19th century Europe. So a lot of merchant marines headed down to the Southern Ocean as fortune seekers to just harvest seals for their hides and whales for their blubber. And that's how the continent of Antarctica was discovered in this modern age. Now, I would propose that humans have been down there and discovered it before then, but we'll just use this historical perspective and say that they first set foot in 1821. However, you have the Piri-Reis map of 1519, the Vouch map, the Mercator map, which included the projection of a 3D planet for the first time on a two-dimensional map, all depicting Antarctica. And the Vouch map is really interesting because it depicts Antarctica as two separate continents. And it wasn't until the whole continent was scanned and understood that indeed there is a channel between Western and Eastern Antarctica, suggesting that perhaps this Vouch map had information of what Antarctica looked like before it was covered in ice. Similarly, the Piri-Reis map, which was only 2 decades after Columbus came to the New World, showing the entire South America outline, as well as Antarctica with some islands that are still as yet discovered. So when I went down there, we had the opportunity to go to a bunch of research stations, including the Palmer base. And when we were in the American Palmer station getting a tour, the head of the station, the chief, said, take a picture of that picture of an ice sheet. He said, that's right out in the bay there. In the 1980s, it was painted. And at that time, it was just one big ice shelf. So I took a picture of it. And then later when we got outside, he said, that's what it looks like today. And you could see an island with a big ice cap on it, but it was not visible in that painting from the 1980s. He said that just a few years earlier on Pi Day, which is in mid-March, the land bridge, the ice bridge connecting to the mainland had collapsed. And so for the very first time, they had discovered a new island down by the Palmer base, suggesting that there are still land masses that are trapped under the ice that are still as of yet discovered. So that was quite fascinating that we're still finding new land masses under the ice. And there are changes in the climate. I know a lot of people, myself included, think that there's an agenda behind climate change to get us all on carbon credit scores and to blame us for the changing weather. But something also is very interesting happening down in Antarctica. And one of the maps that I use in my presentation called The Hidden Anomalies of Antarctica was this map from NASA, which showed the continent where it was heating up, but also where it was cooling down. And this is really amazing because Mother Nature, in her infinite wisdom, is able to balance out the heating and the cooling. So that's why we don't have catastrophic flooding in our coastal communities. Because if Antarctica ice map were ever to melt, it would just be absolutely catastrophic for these coastal communities around the world. Of course, water seeks its own level. So if the Antarctica ice cap were to melt and slide off the continent, it would kind of be like having a cup of water and then filled up to the top and then putting ice into it. Of course, it would overflow. That would be the same thing. And on planet Earth, we essentially live on a water planet. And that is 71% of the surface area of the planet is covered with water. And of course, all the oceans interconnect at one point or another. So if one ocean were to rise, they would all rise. And that's why we haven't seen Miami Beach go underwater, nor anywhere else in a catastrophic way, because it just hasn't happened as predicted. So hopefully it never will, but the bellwether is to keep an eye on Antarctica, make sure that those ice caps don't melt and slide off. One of my colleagues on Antarctica research is Linda Moulton Howe. She started her career investigating cattle mutilations and has a very good reputation of interviewing whistleblowers who come to her and want to release their information through her platform called Earth Files. And Linda has gotten into whistleblowers coming back from Antarctica. The first, who I think is also the best, that she interviewed about 7-8 years ago is a gentleman named Brian S. He remains anonymous, hasn't shown his face in the interview, but he did show some photos of him during his operations. He was flying the big cargo planes all across Antarctica, mostly from McMurdo to the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. And he had some stories to share with Linda about his years flying down there, including seeing silver discs over the Beardmore Glacier, which is in the Trans-Antarctic Mountain Range, and also having an emergency rescue of several scientists who were camping on the Rockefeller Plateau, funny name for all the locations down there, who were doing some research. And I can tell you from my experience, it can be extraordinarily cold and dangerous to be away from your camp more than a few hours, and certainly sleeping overnight on the ice can be absolutely deadly. So there were these scientists that went missing on the Rockefeller Plateau. Of course, they communicate with radio, and this whole group of a dozen or so scientists just dropped off the radar. So Brian S. and his team went out looking for them, found the camp, no sign of anybody, and had to fly back to McMurdo and just say we couldn't find them. Suddenly, about a week later, they get a crackling message over the radio that we're here and we need a pickup immediately. And of course, they went out there and got them, and they were ashen face and wouldn't say a single thing. Hey, where were you guys? We're looking for you. You know, it's dangerous to go missing. Missing on the polar plateau, where presumably where the heck are you going to go? So without saying as much, it's presumed that they found some kind of entrance, perhaps into this inner world this inner earth or some kind of under ice base. And what they saw was absolutely terrifying, because not only would they not tell Brian S. and the crew where they were, but they went back to McMurdo. They were debriefed. They would not talk. They had to go back to New Zealand, and they were treated as if they had been exposed to something dangerous. So they had to go through several different protocols for making sure they weren't carrying some kind of deadly virus with them. So that was kind of peculiar, Brian S. thought. And then his big bombshell with Linda Moulton Howe was when they were tasked to go to the Australian Davis base from McMurdo, and they were ordered to fly around the big no-fly zone, which is just 1 degree off of South Pole. But because it was a life-death situation, they defied the orders and went directly towards the Davis base, saving themselves 20 minutes of fly time. And when they were flying over the no-fly zone, that's when they saw this giant, gaping, multi-mile across hole in the ice. Now, up on the polar plateau where the South Pole Station is located, it's over 2 miles up. So it's very high elevation. Antarctica is the highest elevation continent in the world because of this polar plateau. So a big, giant, gaping hole in the ice certainly caught their attention. And the one thing that I found was most peculiar about his description of the hole is that it also had a road going down into it, like a cat track road that they could drive a snowcat out of the McMurdo or the South Pole Station and go down into it. And so they went and did the emergency rescue at Davis Station. They were taking the person back to South Pole, and then they were going to go on to McMurdo, and they were going to fly over the hole and take another look at it again. And they were given very stern orders. Do not fly over that again. Do your course around the no-fly zone. And indeed, when they did get back to McMurdo, everyone in the crew was called into superior office. They were reprimanded. And just like a lot of people in the military who have had paranormal or UFO experiences, they were told, you didn't see what you just saw, and you're not allowed to talk about it. However, Brian S. never signed a non-disclosure. So years later, he felt it being necessary to get his story out there, and that's what he did. The other whistleblowers Linda Moulton Howe has had on her show is 2 gentlemen in special forces. They too preferred to be anonymous. They go by the name of Spartan 1 and Spartan 2. And they were up on the Beardmore Glacier. This seems to be a paranormal hotspot in Antarctica, where Brian S. saw silver discs flying over, but also where Spartan 1 and 2 said they encountered a large black basalt-like craft wedged in the ice somewhere, and they had a way to enter the craft, and it was mysteriously illuminated on the inside, and it was responsive to their touch. So they could touch a door and it would swing wide open. There were strange hieroglyphs on the wall that they couldn't identify as being Egyptian or anything else. And they were able to walk around this craft, for lack of a better term, and explore around. So I believe that this would have been one of the 3 large mothership-like craft that are said to be in the ice in Antarctica. And our intelligence agencies have known about them since the 1970s and actually gave them the nickname Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, which were the names of the 3 ships that Columbus sailed over on his original journey. I've been able to identify another one of those locations, and it happens to be in the New Schwabenland area of Antarctica that was claimed by the Nazis just before the start of World War II. And out in the field, up on the polar plateau, there's a base called the Conan Base. And I was really amazed when the GPS coordinates for this seasonal base, meaning they're only there for a couple months every summer, lined up with this Google Earth imagery of some kind of excavation under the ice of this Conan base. And this, I think, is the best evidence for one of those three motherships being under the ice. And I really love it when you can get different data points confirming the same story. And indeed, that is the case with the Conan base, because the Farsight Institute remote viewers use those GPS coordinates to locate this craft under the ice that had been excavated in 2013. And indeed, what they found was some kind of manufactured craft that also was built for very large, tall species. They feel that the Farsight Institute, when they remote viewed it, that it was not only a craft that has not been used in many years, but also had been built for some kind of non-human entity, a very tall alien species that were not present anymore, but the craft was still there. Another great mystery of Antarctica is what the landmass was like before it was covered in ice. And many explorers, even starting with the Scott party to go to the South Pole, were finding fossils up above the Beardmore Glacier at a location called Mount Buckley. And the Scott party of 5 members, they were just 35 days behind Roald Amundsen to get there in the year 1911. And they were so despondent to find the Norwegian flag flying at the South Pole that these expeditions are planned out years in advance. And on the way back, they were collecting these fossil samples from Mount Buckley that they were going to take back to the Academy in the United Kingdom. And part of the reason that the Scott party failed on the way back, and all 5 of them, all 5, including Captain Scott himself, perished on the Ross ice shelf. And their bodies remain to this day. They were just buried in the ice where they passed when a rescue party came and found them. And the samples that they took show Antarctica was once a tropical continent, not only with ferns and flora suggesting a jungle-like atmosphere, but also replete with dinosaurs that once existed in Antarctica. Some species of dinosaurs unique completely to Antarctica, meaning they're only found in the fossil records of Antarctica, showing that it had been once part of the giant landmass of Pangaea or Gondwana land and had broke off, because there are some parallels in the fossil record with Australia, with India, with Africa, that all those continents were once connected because the same animals were found in the fossil records there. So that's quite fascinating that Antarctica had once been a steamy jungle where now it's actually just a frozen landmass. Covered 99% of the landmass is covered in ice. Antarctica is also the most volcanically active continent in the world, with 91 known active volcanoes. So with all that geothermal activity, you have the propensity for large under ice domes to exist with fairly temperate climates. You could live down there, in fact, where on the surface it's very difficult to live. And that's why no humans ever lived in Antarctica, just because it would be so hard. And if you were under the ice, you would either have to have some kind of hydroponic method of growing your own food or having it shipped in. So only in this modern age could that be possible. Yet, it's also possible that you could have an extraterrestrial race down there, or these pre-Adamite, as they're known, species of human-like, not quite human, they were actually giants that perhaps came from Mars or other planets. And by coming here, they were in one of those 3 mothership craft that got stuck in Antarctica and actually had to live out their lives and perhaps finally perished in Antarctica or perhaps survived. And this is why there's so much secrecy with the continent, with these no-fly zones, with this hole in the ice, with the NSA, which was created in the 1940s, but wasn't even admitted to until the 1980s, and that's where it got the acronym No Such Agency for the National Security Agency, and they are tasked with all things extraterrestrial. So they're the ones at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station protecting the no-fly zone, making sure nobody can go out there, calling back the planes, for example. And they're also tasked with anything such as a craft retrieval, such as alien bodies. The NSA is Johnny on the spot when it comes to a downed craft. They're the first ones there to cordon off the area, create a cover story if necessary, and to extract all the parts, personnel, bodies, and different craft to take back to some of our laboratories for backward engineering. So the NSA has a building in McMurdo Station, which is the largest research station in Antarctica run by the Americans. And there's an unmarked building in McMurdo that's run by the NSA, and nobody knows what's going on in there. Presumably, it's a big warehouse type building that when they do accumulate craft or bodies, what have you, to take back to America, that first they have to go through McMurdo and they can be stored in Antarctica before they can get them on one of those big cargo planes to fly back. So there's stories of these pre-Adamite giants living in Antarctica, and some of them have been found as bodies, but some of them are said to be awakening, coming out of a sleep-like stasis and now ready to emerge back onto the planet. So this is an interesting ongoing story about how these giants are now awakening down in Antarctica and what they're going to do when they're fully awakened back. Our planet has these plates that are very fluid, as Brooks Agnew described them as cornflakes on top of a bowl of milk, that when the poles move, and indeed there is evidence that right now the magnetic South Pole and the magnetic North Pole are on the move like they've never been before. In fact, the magnetic South Pole is now off the continent and moving towards Australia. And so if this was an indication where the poles would shift in a 45-degree movement, which is very sudden, it only takes a couple of days, but of course would be absolutely catastrophic to all the life on the planet because it would create tremendous earthquakes, the rising and falling of continents, volcanoes blowing off, tidal waves all over the planet, that it would reset the polar landscapes to be more over North America. So Canada would be the new North Pole, extending all the way down into the Pacific Northwest. Similarly, Australia would be the new southern South Pole. Then that would leave Antarctica in more of a temperate climate, and the ice would rapidly melt. We would finally be able to see what's really under the ice and could expose antediluvian civilization. There are some reports that there are excavations down there where they're finding not only some of these pre-Adamite giants, but they're located in megalithic structures, as well as finding megafauna, that is, woolly mammoths, large ice age mammals, that also once existed in Antarctica, and maybe still does, because in the secret diary of Admiral Byrd, where he said he flew into the hole in the ice, which he discovered 18 years earlier as the first aviator to fly over the South Pole. Admiral Byrd, after the tragic loss during the Battle of High Jump, in Operation High Jump, was summoned to fly with just his radio man to the South Pole. And knowing that this gaping hole was there, large enough to accommodate his flying into the hole and then back out, was summoned into the inner Earth, where while he was flying, the first thing they noticed was verdant green valleys and flowing creeks, saying to his radio man, this shouldn't exist. And then seeing something like an elephant as they got closer, they did another double take, and indeed it was a woolly mammoth down there. And then while Admiral Byrd was still flying to Flugelrads, or the UFOs of the Germans, came wingtip to wingtip, and he lost control of his plane. This is what he wrote about in his diary. And they took him down to this emerald-like city. I always use the example of the Wizard of Oz, of some fantastic-looking crystal city under the ice, where Admiral Byrd was summoned to visit the master. And he noticed when his plane was taken down by remote control, out of his control, that the two UFO saucer crate ships had Nazi insignia on them. And when he got out of the ship, his plane, to go meet the master, that he noticed that the two pilots had German accents and also had insignia on their uniforms, suggesting it was a variation of the Third Reich, probably the Fourth Reich, and this could be the New Berlin base that was prophesized in the early 1940s by Admiral Dolan, saying that we have created an impregnable fortress for the Fuhrer in a great area of frozen land, suggesting that this was Antarctica. But they wouldn't have been able to build this crystal city in just the few years when Operation High Jump, and Admiral Byrd was summoned to meet the master, who he said was of an otherworldly nature, could communicate with him telepathically, but they were able to speak in English. And the master was very concerned with the United States having just developed nuclear bomb technology at the Trinity site in White Sands, New Mexico, and then dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan to end World War II. The master said, we know that you're a very high-ranking and esteemed admiral in the U.S. government. We would like you to go back and warn your governments not to use nuclear weapons, that this has a ripple effect through the dimensional states that would affect them and other ET races. And of course, Admiral Byrd said he would. And when he was leaving Antarctica after Operation High Jump, he mentioned to one of the reporters who came on his ship when they were resupplying in Chile, and he said, and it was reported in the El Mercurio newspaper, that Admiral Byrd warned that we would be confronted with an enemy that would be able to fly pole to pole at incredible speeds, saying this in 1947, with a kind of technology that we still don't have disclosed to the world today, that could fly in one shot from pole to pole at incredible speeds. And when Admiral Byrd did get back to the Pentagon, he was not treated as a hero. He too went into quarantine and was reprimanded for making that statement, but also debriefed for many weeks before they finally let him go home to his family after Operation High Jump, finding everything they could about this inner Earth civilization, what kind of technology they had, and coming to the stark realization that the Germans had not lost World War II. In fact, the Third Reich, the political arm of Nazi Germany, never surrendered, nor did the SS, which was a secret society within and using the best of the best. It's estimated that up to 250,000 officers and SS personnel escaped Germany at the end of the war, using their large U-boat fleet to go down to their base 211 and their new Berlin base, where they were able to continue working on their backward engineered flying craft, which then was seen by Admiral Byrd on his expedition down there. So just more incredible testimony from a very high-ranking and decorated admiral, someone who knew Antarctica better than any living human being on the planet, to write in his diary that he went into this inner Earth environment where there was some kind of heat source and ultraviolet rays that could grow plant and tree life underneath the polar plateau, with flowing rivers in a temperate climate where woolly mammoths live. If it was anybody except for Admiral Byrd who was saying these things, probably nobody would take him too seriously, but his son was given the diary upon Admiral Byrd's death with instruction that Admiral Byrd would like to have this story told, and the son then published the secret diary of Admiral Byrd. So after World War II, the British had been spying on the Nazis down in Antarctica, called Operation Tamerlane. And I actually went to visit Port Lockroy, which was one of the spying stations, including another one down by the Vernansky base, which they donated to the Ukrainians, was originally a British spying station. And they were tasked with trying to intercept radio messages and spying on the New Schwabenland claim of Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, where they were detecting U-boat traffic continuing to bring down personnel and material. So after the war ended, there was a great exodus of the German U-boats. In fact, many of them still to this day have never been accounted for. They know that they were built and they had their code numbers on them, but have never resurfaced. So in a book by Henry Stevens called The Black Sun, he describes the final battle of World War II was actually out in the North Atlantic, and it was a resounding defeat of the Allied forces, because this was the Führer's convoy. This was taking the most important personnel and equipment out of Nazi Germany at the very tail end of the war, including Adolf Hitler himself. The History Channel did a very remarkable documentary series called Hunting Hitler over 3 seasons and 35 episodes or so, going to these locations in South America, some of which I went to visit, but also touching on Antarctica as this refuge of the New Berlin base. So the Americans were tipped off by the British that the Nazis, some of the highest personnel, had escaped, and they were tasked with mounting an operation. It wasn't just the Americans, but other Allied countries all came together in Operation High Jump, 1946, 1947, supposedly as a scientific research mission, yet it was going down there as a military flotilla, replete with aircraft carriers, submarines, 33 aircraft, 4,600 trained military troops that appeared were ready for some kind of military engagement and landing on the continent to confront these Antarctica Nazis. And when they had all convened right around New Schwabenland offshore with this flotilla head by Admiral Byrd himself in a ship called the USS Mount Olympus. They were all there, and they had located some outbuildings in New Schwabenland at the base 211. They had done a little pitter-pat of bombing the day before, but then the day of the Battle of High Jump, Admiral Byrd had ordered his bombers to go out there and really carpet bomb the area. When those ships were approaching base 211, all of them just went blip right off the screen. Those planes and those pilots and personnel have never been seen or heard from ever again. So that bombing sortie did not succeed. Great loss of life and those planes. But also on the same day, out where the armada of ships was, up out of the ocean came these flying craft, these UFO flying disc craft, to confront the armada of ships. And while they could have easily taken out the entire armada, they didn't. They just took out one ship called the USS Murdoch, and what could be described as a directed energy weapon or a very high powerful laser beam just sliced the ship in half, with of course great loss of life, because even if you jumped overboard in time before the ship sank very rapidly, you would die of hypothermia very quickly. The anti-aircraft weapons against these flying UFOs couldn't touch them. There was some kind of force field around these craft, and in a show of force, again, for Admiral Byrd to take back to his superiors at the Pentagon, don't mess with the Antarctica Nazi station because we have technology beyond your wildest dreams. And in fact, they did. So the last two battles of World War II were actually won by the Nazis, who then reformulated themselves as the Fourth Reich. And while the German fighting forces of the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe and the Navy did surrender on VE Day, the Fourth Reich became more of an intelligence and high-tech new form of government. And in Henry Stevens' book, and also Joseph Farrell has done quite a bit of research on the Fourth Reich, called Nazi International, was his book. He was saying that this third force was fanning the flames of discontent between the Soviet bloc and the NATO bloc. And this is why we had the Cold War, because they were still operating behind the scenes and keeping those two superpowers at each other's throat, where all the while it was this intelligence force, this third force of the reformulated Nazis. And of course, James Rink has a lot of great information about the German secret space program, the Nachtwaffen, which is also the Dark Fleet, allied with the reptilian forces operating out of Antarctica. In fact, it's said that the base 211 was an old reptilian base that was just donated to the Nazis to use for their own purposes, which they did. So that's very interesting that you have reptilian, malevolent ET connection also going hand in hand. And who knows, it could have been reptilian craft that came up out of the water that confronted Admiral Byrd. Well, of course, the Americans didn't take that too well, losing two battles at the end of World War II. And of course, they were very keen on confronting those Nazis once again. But before they could, there was the famous flyover of Washington, D.C., of several craft, and it was on the newspaper cover around the country in 1952 of these crafts flying over the Capitol building, penetrating the most secretive and protective airspace in the world. And here you have a dozen or so craft flying right over the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. For a long time, everybody assumed that they were UFOs of an extraterrestrial nature. Now, most UFO researchers would agree those were the Antarctica Nazis flying pole to pole at incredible speeds to confront the United States and basically force surrender treaties. And this is now, according to new information from Laura Eisenhower, who is a great-granddaughter of Dwight D. Eisenhower, that it was actually Truman who signed these surrender papers, and that Dwight D. Eisenhower just inherited a very bad deal. He was very upset with the military-industrial complex, as we know in his farewell speech. But he also threatened to take the First Army into Area 51 when he was denied access to that super secret compound in Nevada on the Nellis Air Force Base. That never happened. They worked out some kind of arrangement. But you can see at that point, things had started to go out of control, and these Fourth Reich Nazis had gained quite a bit of power and control within our American government. Of course, we know about Project Paperclip, where we were taking their scientists right out of Nazi Germany and putting them in high-ranking positions. And this is part of the neo-fascism problem that we have in this country today. And I would say it all traces back to this Fourth Reich Third Force that has been a player ever since the end of World War II. Operation High Jump ended 2 months into the 6-month campaign. That's always been a question about why Admiral Byrd ordered a retreat. Well, they were resoundingly defeated in the Battle of High Jump is one reason, but also because they knew that they had to come back with higher technology to finally confront the Nazis. Then you had, in the following years, another expedition in which Admiral Byrd went down there called Operation Deep Freeze. And this was not so much of a confrontation with two militaries, but more to try to root out some of the Nazi bases and get more intelligence on it. And in fact, the flyover of Washington, D.C. then happened in subsequent years, forcing this treaty on Truman, which was then adapted by the Eisenhower administration, much to his chagrin that he had to go along with it. Then there was the nuclear bomb testing, ostensibly to blow a hole in the upper atmosphere and test nuclear weapons down in the Southern Ocean, right in the area of New Schwabenland. And this was called Operation Argus. And in Operation Argus was, the cover story was they were doing nuclear bomb testing of the upper atmosphere in this alternative one to allow the pollution to escape. But in fact, they were nuking the Antarctica Nazis in 1958 as retaliation. By that time, most of the staff and personnel had left. They didn't really like it there. They were isolated from any outside viruses, because when you live in a sterile environment like Antarctica where no viruses or bacteria can exist naturally, every time a supply ship would come or a U-boat with personnel from the outside, if just one person had the remnants of a cold, it would sweep through the whole Antarctica colony, and then everybody would get sick. So they were just kind of getting tired of being down there. So by the time of Operation Argus, they had moved almost all of the personnel and material to their secret bases in Chile and Argentina. And when I was going over the maps of my South America trip before and after I went to Antarctica, I was discovering that there are huge land holdings in Chile and Argentina that act as micronations. That is, they are their own countries in so much that they can operate independently, such as the Vatican City within the city of Rome, within the country of Italy, but it's its own micronation. And so the Germans had set this up pre-World War II, had started buying land holdings as well as financing corporations, because the money man, the number two under Hitler at the end of the war, was a man named Martin Bormann. He kept popping up all over South America in the 1950s, where they were building their Fourth Reich empire. And this had been noticed by our intelligence forces, but some of them had started to come over to the side of the Fourth Reich. And that's why the CIA was responsible for deposing democratically elected leaders and propping up others, such as Perón in Argentina, terrible fascist president of that country, and then Pinochet in Chile, to depose a democratically elected leader there, putting in a fascist. So it's very interesting that Chile and Argentina are very closely connected for thousands of miles along the spine of the Andes Mountains. And when I was down in San Carlos de Bariloche in Patagonia, there was the Enelco house where, in hunting Hitler, they had found the house and saw that it had stovepipes for an underground base there. They even went ashore and they found where the seaplane was located. So if the authorities were ever moving in on the Enelco house, they could get Martin Bormann and even Hitler himself onto the seaplane, fly out of the big lake there, and cross the spine of the Andes Mountains and get into Chile and be safe at another safe house. So I do believe Hitler lived out his natural life in South America. It's said that he's buried underneath a hotel in the capital of Paraguay. Can't confirm that, but when I was down there, there was a big news story that somebody's cache of Nazi artifacts, some very valuable and SS artifacts. It was a big news story when I was down there. Just thousands of items was discovered in somebody's private collection. And this could have only been collected with a large amount of personnel to have thousands of items down there. So many Nazi sympathizers in South America. In fact, it wasn't until the very end of the war that Chile and Argentina were pressured to join the Allies. Before then, they were very sympathetic to Nazi Germany. And indeed, I went to several locations, not only around Bariloche, which is just like a town out of southern Bavaria, Germany, but also another town called La Falda near some of the industrial hubs, including Cordoba, where the Nazis had set up several corporations. And now Argentina is kind of a basket case of a country, kind of like the way the Marcos family had stolen all the wealth from the Philippine government. But Argentina had the possibility, had the potential to be a real powerhouse economic force, but the kleptomaniacs in government stole all the resources, and that's not the case with Argentina today. 2 years before I went down to Antarctica on a sailboat for 26 days to the Palmer Peninsula and islands off of the Palmer Peninsula, a very curious thing happened with a lot of world leaders and royal family members, and even one of the Apollo 11 astronauts, Buzz Aldrin, were going down to Antarctica for unknown reasons. And they all happened to be in the same season, that is 2016 and 2017. You had King Carlos of Spain, an elderly man, and I can tell you it's not easy to travel down there. It's really difficult, in fact, and the weather and the climate is very harsh. So for these old men like Patriarch Krill from Russia, also an elderly man, to go down to Antarctica, you kind of have to scratch your head and say, what are they really doing down there? And Buzz Aldrin made this cryptic tweet that he has seen the face of evil and that we're all in danger. And then that tweet quickly came down. But nonetheless, Buzz Aldrin had to be medically evacuated. He had some kind of health issue and they had to get him out of there. So maybe he did see the face of evil and maybe we are all in danger. You also had John Kerry, an acting Secretary of State, the highest ranking U.S. official, to go down to Antarctica on Election Day in 2016 when Trump beat Hillary Clinton. It's presumed that when John Kerry got to McMurdo, he went missing for several days, that he went to one of these under ice bases to get his marching orders. What are we going to do about this Trump guy and how should we handle this? That the actual leaders of this interplanetary corporate conglomerate are based out of Antarctica. And John Kerry was going down there to find out what they wanted to do with this new president, Donald Trump, who had taken the office against all odds and certainly set them back quite a bit on their timeline as far as pushing forward this New World Order agenda. So it was quite interesting that at that same time, Prince Harry was also going down there with some of his army buddies, but he was going to the South Pole to go cross-country skiing. Well, there's nothing down there on the polar plateau for hundreds of miles, yet they just left the South Pole Station and went in the direction of that no-fly zone and presumably going to see this giant hole under the ice, which got the nickname the Illuminati Disneyland, that perhaps this is where they were going, including John Kerry himself, to go to this inner Earth civilization and to see it with their own eyes. But of course, the common folk can't do it. Only elite or royalty would be allowed to get anywhere near there. Antarctica is the most volcanically active continent in the world with 91 known volcanoes. You have the propensity of the geothermal features to melt large cavities under the ice, where it's presumed other life forms could exist or that other civilizations could set up their own shop down there and be able to actually even manufacture using geothermal heat for a power source. So the Nazis had seized upon one of those fault lines, and one of the first locations they went to inland was a place called the Schumacher Ponds, named after the pilot Schumacher, who landed one of the seaplanes off the MS Schwabenland ship, and his ground party left for several days, I believe, to go and find that defunct reptilian base that they were going to be allowed to refurbish for their own purposes. But while Schumacher stayed behind with the seaplane, he did several tests in the ponds and found out that the water got warmer as it got deeper. Usually it's the other way around. With a thermocline, the warmer water rises to the top. But in the case of the Schumacher Ponds, it actually got a lot warmer as it went down, and that's why these ponds never freeze. So the Nazis had established their base 211 right on a fault line with this geothermal features, and it's presumed that other bases are down there as well, perhaps much older, and utilizing these geothermal features in different ways that they can survive down there. So that's really interesting that the fault lines along the Transantarctic Mountains have volcanoes. Mount Erebus right by McMurdo Station is an active volcano with a lake of lava in the crater. It's only one of two locations. The other is in Africa, along the African Rift, that has active volcano lake inside the crater. So that creates a whole bunch of very interesting geological features around Mount Erebus and elsewhere. Just off of Antarctica are the peri-Antarctic islands, is what they're called, and most of them are volcanic. Some of the southernmost islands are not necessarily active. Some are dormant or extinct volcanoes poking up out of the ground, and there's an island chain called the South Sandwich Islands. The southernmost island is Southern Thule Island, and this was a place with a very remote scientific research station called Corabeta, Uruguay, run by the Argentinians. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, and there are many questions about the Falkland Wars in 1982, when Britain was sending a huge armada of ships to go capture these very sparsely populated Falkland Islands and the South Sandwich Islands. And in fact, you can see on Wikipedia that the armada of ships splits into two groups. Very few people know that the Falkland Wars was fought on two fronts. Most people just remember what happened around the capital of Stanley in the Falkland Wars. But in fact, there was a whole other armada of ships that was going to capture these mostly uninhabited islands. In fact, the war ended when surrender papers were signed off the coast of South Thule Island. And when the 8 scientists saw the battleships from the United Kingdom coming to their base, they put up a surrender flag. No shots were fired. And the Falkland War actually ended at Southern Thule Island. And so many war historians were thinking, what the heck was that all about? Going down there with great loss of lives, mostly to the Argentinians. It was a very one-sided war. The British sunk a Argentinian battleship called the Belgrano with great loss of life. I was down in Ushuaia before we set sail for Antarctica, and they had something similar to our Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., of all the names of all the very young conscripts that went down with the Belgrano. And the Argentinians are still very upset over the Falkland Wars. Those islands are just offshore of Argentina, and they can't understand why the world community is not up in arms in protest, why they wouldn't allow, they call them Isla Maldiva, that they would not be Argentinian territory, but in fact British territory. And so the second armada of ships that broke off to capture these mostly uninhabited islands was so important it had its own name. It was called Operation Keyhole, which culminated in the surrender of South Thule Island. And what was it that was so important for them to go down there to capture this research station, which, by the way, after they captured it and got the surrendered scientists off of it, they just destroyed the base. But they were there to get something very important, and that was the black goo. And it was deposited there by extraterrestrials a very long time ago by a benevolent race of ETs. And you think about black goo, it's a sentient, perhaps AI-induced substance that will glom together, and it can be used for rapidly cloning if that's what is necessary. And that's why it was brought here by the extraterrestrial race after the Toba explosion 71,000 years ago. And I actually had the opportunity to go to Lake Toba on the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. And it's this great big freshwater caldera lake with an island in the middle that exploded 71,000 years ago and put up all this ash that it created a nuclear winter scenario, and that there were so few humans on the planet, only 30,000 or so humans on the entire planet. This is why we have such similar DNA among all the human species, is because there were just so few of us. And at that time, Earth was very susceptible and vulnerable to an alien invasion because there were just so few humans. However, the surface of Earth has always been, the destiny was the humans would live here. And now we have 8 billion of us. Think about that. In 71,000 years, we went from 35,000 humans to 8 billion. That just shows you how quickly humans can reproduce. But the black goo was brought here and stored on this frozen South Thule Island because in a freezing temperature all year round, it is rendered inert. Therefore, it cannot multiply, it cannot regroup itself. And so the Argentinians were studying the black goo at the Corbeta, Uruguay base during the Falkland Wars for several years prior, and doing it in a very respectful and responsible way, keeping it frozen, knowing that if this were ever to get out, it would wreak havoc. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. That the whole Falkland Wars was a cover with the objective of getting the black goo and taking it back to the United Kingdom, which they did, and were backward engineering it in the Marconi laboratories in London, England, and it got loose and it killed dozens of scientists and people within Marconi. There were many cover stories that there were suicides or very strange deaths. But I think the black goo got out and it affected these people, and it is now out in the world today. It has the properties of graphene oxide, which we've come to learn is in the injectables, that has also is very black and goo-like in nature, but has a way of self-replicating and spreading throughout the host if need be. So the Falkland Wars, which was fought over to get this black goo and use in a military or even super soldier application, got out. And James Rink, of course, has many times talked about some of the Nachtwaffen having to take the black goo, that it will get inside the body and take over. Most importantly, it'll take over your mind so that you can be controlled by this stuff. And we are living in a very strange time now where this black goo has gotten out. And incidentally, the whole Morgellons syndrome only started a decade after the British got the black goo back to the Marconi laboratories, were attempting to backward engineer it and control it. But being in a warmer climate, it got out of control. So you have the Morgellons syndrome, and you have this hydrogel developed by DARPA, and the graphene oxide, all with very similar properties of what this black goo is. So it's already starting to appear in humans and animals. So we were warned by some of the ET groups that were monitoring what the Argentinians were doing with the black goo on South Thule Island, that if this were ever to get out, it would wreak havoc. And we're seeing it happening today. Underneath the ice of Antarctica is an entire system of lakes and rivers that drain these lakes and flow out the rivers to the ocean. one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world, in the top 10 largest freshwater lakes that nobody's ever heard of, is called Lake Vostok, and that is under the ice 2.2 miles under the polar plateau. First discovered using satellites because they saw the depression of the ice dome covering the lake and thought, well, that's out of the ordinary. There must be something under there. And they're probing. The Russians have a base there called the Vostok base. And they were probing under the ice. They finally got a drill to go down 2.2 miles to puncture into this under ice dome, and then also finding that there was this huge freshwater lake, which they named Lake Vostok. When they first got their drill down there in 2016, they had to use kerosene to keep the drill bit from freezing. And the very first water dip that they did was contaminated. So it wasn't until a couple years later that they got a clean sample out of Lake Vostok, and they looked at any kind of microorganisms under the microscope and found that there was a kind of bacteria that comes off of a fish but had never been seen before. So the presumption is there's a whole bunch of different kind of life that lives in Lake Vostok that has as yet been discovered. Well, Russians, being as Russians are, also wanting to find out if there was anything else down there. There were stories in Nexus magazine and other publications that they sent down a exploratory party, not only to explore the surface area of Lake Vostok and the shoreline, but also replete with scuba diving equipment to go down into the lake. And they had a team scuba diving down in Lake Vostok, and they were confronted with some kind of sea monster, this according to these news reports in the alternative press, that confronted some of the divers and actually was able to consume or cut those divers off from their oxygen supply with a loss of life. But some of the Russian divers survived, came back up to tell the story, and that news story then leaked to the alternative media. So there may be some kind of creatures in Lake Vostok which are very dangerous and deadly to human exploration in the depths of the lake, which is a very deep lake too, that was carved out from glacial activity before it was covered in ice. So it's a very ancient lake too, but completely cut off from the outside world because it's under this huge plateau of ice in Antarctica. So in the northern and southern hemispheres, there is the phenomenon, we call it the northern lights or aurora borealis in the northern hemisphere, but the same effect occurs in the southern hemisphere, but they call it the aurora australis. And australis was the name for this land of lore that was supposed to exist in the southern hemisphere when the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, who the island Tasmania off of Australia, pretty much charted most of the coast of Australia. That's where they got the name Australis from, where the southern continent of Antarctica was actually presumed by the ancient Greeks that there must be a southern continent to offset the balance of the land masses to the north. And they were absolutely correct. One of the northernmost constellations in the northern hemisphere is called Arctus. So the name Antarctis means the opposite of Arctis, and that's where the name Antarctica comes from. And so with this phenomenon of the northern and southern lights, you can see these magnificent colors if you happen to be down in Antarctica during their winter, which is a very harsh period of time where it's many months of total darkness. And in fact, during the Antarctica winter, when all of the seasonal bases empty out and just a skeleton crew stays behind with the other bases, there are only 1,000 people living in Antarctica during their winter down there. And so very few people have ever seen the Aurora Australis, but they would have to be stationed there with the skeleton crew. Turns out that the northern and southern lights, they do occur year-round, but you just can't see them in the daytime. And in the summer, they have 4 months at the South Pole of just daylight, no nighttime at all. And just similarly in the wintertime, they also have 4 months of total darkness. So if you are stationed down there, you will see it. And one of my colleagues, another person I know who has been to Antarctica, Eric Hecker, he says he saw them when he was stationed down there all winter long. And boy, was it cold and very dangerous. You couldn't even go outside with even the smallest bit of your skin exposed. So everything had to be covered or you'd get frostbite within minutes. It was that cold. The other very interesting concept is that at one time, Antarctica had been a temperate climate and hosted different civilizations that left behind megalithic monuments, which some reports say have been excavated from out on the ice, but also these pyramids that are poking through. And I know 3 locations where they're located. One of them is not too far from McMurdo in the McMurdo Sound, and Eric Hecker had a long poster, and right there it says pyramid, and there's a pyramid-shaped mountain on it. Another is in Oates Land, just directly south of New Zealand, and the one that we see so much on Ancient Aliens and other TV shows is in the Ellsworth mountain range of western Antarctica. And when I was talking to a group that does trips down there, showing them some of my photos, including those pyramids in the Ellsworth range, and I said, well, what do you think of these? And he dismissed it. He said, well, yeah, I've flown over that a number of times, and we just considered it a nunatak, which just means an attractive, symmetrical mountain poking through the ice. And I said, well, did you ever land a plane there? Did you ever check it out or go see it? No, we never did. Climb it, take a sample. No, we just flew over it. We call it a nunatak. And then I said, well, I guess the jury's still out until we can get some boots on the ground and check it out. And so that's just another one of the great mysteries of Antarctica. My name's Brad Olsen, and that's the name of my website, bradolsen.com, and also CCC Publishing, where my books in the esoteric series, which I write a lot about these mysteries I've just discussed today, you can find, including modern esoteric, future esoteric, and beyond esoteric. Thank you for having me on Super Soldier Talk.
Please consider supporting Super Soldier Talk by purchasing your own Neo Meditation device. Your Neo Meditation device will help you reduce stress, integrate trauma, enhance intuition, enhance clairvoyance, and enhance creativity. Get yours now at www.neologicaltech.com.